From Bob Marley to start us off with our history lesson for today, which is the roots of the global economy. We're going to concentrate on a very tiny section of the guest reading in this chapter. And what we're going to do is kind of walk through a lot of human history. And I sometimes think I should start out with this as my very first class. And so most of it is going to be kind of rooted in guest, with a few extra things here and there. Actually, maybe it's more extra things and every so often a reference to guest. But I want to first start off by asking, well, what should this matter to us? Why should we care about the roots of the global economy? Because as much as I feel how hugely important this is, I feel like as I go through it, it always ends up being a little bit maybe too much detail, too much history, puts everybody to sleep. I get bored myself. So I'm trying to figure out a way to do this because this is, I think that's hugely important. And if I want to spell out sort of three ways that I think we should care or why, and sort of keep coming back to those. And the first of those is just to sort of get some important facts out on the table for us. And I mean, some of us we've heard about, I think, we're taught in school about the slave trade, and we're taught about the triangle trade, maybe a little bit of Columbus here and there, indigenous peoples, we're taught about some of these things. But there's a lot of stuff in there that was humongously important for the development of the United States, for the development of the world, that people just don't mention very much, in part because our textbooks are US-centric, but some of these things are even unknown to the people who live in the places or, the very countries where some of these things are happening. And so, Bob Marley talks to us here about knowing our history, if you know your history. And so part of this is going to be a little bit of some historical details. I was actually a history major in college, didn't come to anthropology until later on. And so I'll admit I sort of, get really into some of the details here. I always learn things myself when I'm doing the research for this class. But I think that if we just sort of, every so often, you can just say, hey, why is that important? Part of it is just because of so much that we don't know about our own history. So starting off with what, the subject of Bob Marley's song, which is the Buffalo Soldiers, who were, these black cavalry regiments that formed after the Civil War and were basically stationed to fight the Indians, to subdue the West. And so, you had, they actually also fought in Cuba in the Spanish-American War, so hugely important in the war, that would give these states, that would take these states away from Spain, away from Mexico. But I mean, if you think about where where the black cavalry were stationed, it's like, hey, look, there they are up in Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, places that you just don't think about as being places where people of African American descent might have been crucial to the colonization of the West, as it were. And so apparently it was in fact the Native Americans themselves who gave the nickname Buffalo Soldiers to these black regiments. They fought valiantly in lots of different ways for the United States, but then were subsequently forgotten and diminished in history. And so, if we want to talk about something like, we've been talking about intersectionality, right? And, what does it mean to be, black, male? Does it, is it always a condition of sort of being subjugated in relationship to others? And there's a lot of interchange between various groups that has gone unnoticed. And this is one of those cases where you'd have, in some ways, yes, they had a subjugated position in American society, but they were also sort of fighting the war, as Bob Marley puts it, the war for America. so that Americans could colonize the western states. Second big question, which I sort of asked, is that when we think about the movements of populations from the 1500s into some of the great migrations of the 19th century, from like 1800 to 1900, it has a lot to do with why all of us are in the places we are. And some of these are more recent migrations, of course. But one of the points that I think we need to be aware of is how deep some of these migrations are, how large some of the movements of populations were. And so we shouldn't be shocked or surprised, when we find Spanish speakers in Colorado, or we find people with funny French-sounding names in the Caribbean. This shouldn't be a surprise to us. And so I think sometimes, we go into kind of these diversity training seminars and things like that, and we're taught to, sort of respect other cultures and respect diversity, but we're not really taught, well, what are people doing in the places they are? Like, why did we have so much cultural and population mixture to begin with? And what I love about Marley's song is he says, if you know your history, then you're going to know where you're coming from, and you wouldn't have to ask me, who the heck do I think I am? Which is to say, hey, many of us have a reason that we were either brought here or came here or wherever we are. And, it's like, it's important to know why it is that certain populations ended up in certain places. A lot of times they were moved around against their will. And so, we don't have to ask, well, what are you doing here? It's like, what do you think I'm doing here, man? I had to fight a war for you. The third big reason, which is perhaps bigger for me than for you, is that the whole discipline of anthropology doesn't really make any sense unless you know about this period from, the voyages of the Europeans up through 1900. In part because, in truth, anthropology is one of the most recent academic disciplines. There were always people who were wondering about other peoples and writing about other peoples, travelers, explorers, etc. But as kind of an academic discipline, as a thing where people systematically tried to learn about other peoples, it's maybe 130, 150 years at most. So anthropology emerges kind of at the very end of the period we're going to be talking about. And that's important for a couple of reasons, because a lot of people think, well, anthropology goes off and studies these people who are, off isolated in the jungle somewhere in the Arctic, and they've never seen a television, and there's no Coca-Cola. And the truth of the matter is, when anthropologists were first studying all of the people they studied, the people they were studying were not isolated. They weren't, to the degree that they would be considered primitive, it was often because they had already been sort of displaced, sort of enslaved in many cases, certainly moved around, transformed. It's not to say that they were all, that their former cultures were completely eradicated, or even that all populations suffered equally, or that there weren't key people in these populations who profited greatly from colonialism. There were definitely indigenous people who profited greatly from trade, and there were definitely Africans who were engaged in and profited greatly from the slave trade. But the point of the matter is every population was in some ways influenced or transformed by these global movements, even though if they didn't necessarily know it or realize it themselves, simply talk about maybe this more in the next class, simply by the movement of things and products and crops into different places. And the other key thing, and I think this is important even outside of anthropology, is that all of the stereotypes that we, and by we I mean mostly those engaged in European style, American style education, all of the stereotypes that we have about other people, about so-called primitives or savages, come to us or are formed in this time period. And so again, this is not, I mean, certainly, like I said, this is perhaps more of interest to anthropology majors and anthropologists like me, but I hope it's also of interest to everyone, because this was sort of where you get all those ideas about people who don't have an adequate language, or who don't have, who don't have a religion, or who aren't able to govern themselves. This is the period in which those kinds of stereotypes all came up. So those will be our three kind of main points here. And I hope it works. We'll see how it goes. Like I said, there's a lot of texty stuff. There might be a lot, sometimes I get perhaps too into the historical detail. The first part of this, though, is going to be very broad sweep of, I'm going to do I'm not going to do the history before 1500. I'm just going to do a sort of very broad sweep when we go back 2,000 years or so, maybe even 10,000 years. And I will just say that, people were migrating, they were interacting, they were trading. There were, different political empires in all different parts of the world, cities, urban areas, but people also were developing their hunting techniques, transforming their ecosystems, etc. There's a book called Questioning Collapse, which was written by or edited by a couple archaeologists, and I've always sort of found fascinating one of the things they talk about, which is if you sort of did an archaeological type survey of what we would consider the most powerful or largest cities in the world, the places that were urban and where things were happening at these various time periods. So they start out and they say, well, at 500 AD or 500 Common Era, for those of you who want to take more updated terminology, 500 CE, 500 years after, or 1,500 years ago, if you want to put it that way. The most dynamic cities at the time would have been located in what is now Mexico, what is now Italy, and what is now China. Now, if you fast forward 500 years or you rewind 1,000 years from the present, you would find the cities had changed a little bit, and that now we see them in what is now Peru, or what it would have been the precursors to the Incan Empire, Iraq, and in Central Asia. And then if you go back 500 years to sort of where we're going to start from, I don't know if we're starting there, but around the Columbus voyages, you'd find the most powerful cities in China, China, India, and Turkey, which is, we'll see where that is in a second. One of the things I want to point out from this is that in all this time, the places that would come to dominate the later story of the next few hundred years, especially the Northern European places, were not really seen as that important to what was going on in world history. I might be exaggerating a little bit when I'd say they were a barbaric backwater, although when the Romans were up north, they probably did really think that this were total barbarians. But, you know, they weren't they were kind of not very big players on what we might call this big scene of world history during this time. So part of what we have to explain is how these sort of kind of backwater places in Northern Europe became so powerful, and that, you know, how did you know, the idea that English, if we go back to our language unit, how did English become, you know, one of the most dominant languages in the world? You know, if you rewound 500, 600, 700 years ago, no one would have ever predicted the dominance of English as a language. So, start out with what Guest calls the trade routes, or the trade routes between across Eurasia, but also including Africa. And here I've given you a little map of the routes of a little known, at least outside of, at least in the West, for most of us, a little known explorer, a Muslim cleric, Ibn Battuta, who was traveling. He actually logged the most miles of any explorer that we know, almost 10 times as many as Marco Polo. And he went all around what was, you know, considered what we now call the old world, or, you know, he went into Southern Europe, but mostly, you know, he spent a lot of time in what was the Islamic Empire, but he also was in India and China. He wrote about this later on in life. He was kind of he was a scholar or a cleric, but what this I'm trying to get at here is how much people were moving around, were trading, interacting, and how dynamic some of these early or some of these trade routes were as of, you know, 700, 800 years ago. And as we were talking about, one of those sort of dynamic areas of the world at, you know, 500, 600, 700 years ago was actually the Islamic Empire. So it is because of Islam that, and the expansion of this empire, that we had the preservation of the Greek texts and some of the mathematics. If you think about Arabic numerals and how useful it is to have Arabic numerals for multiplying and doing math instead of Roman numerals, which are not so useful when you're trying to multiply and divide things, but also various agricultural techniques. And as we'll talk about, that's where they started importing azúcar, or what that is a borrowed word in Spanish for sugar, and sort of some of the sugar growing techniques were developed in the Islamic Empire. You can see here how extensive the Islamic Empire was. It went all the way into what is called the Iberian Peninsula, so all of Spain and Portugal, and even the southwestern part of France, where they were stopped around here and didn't make it further north into Europe, but a very dynamic and interesting empire, which had a long run here. But what was happening in this peninsula, this Iberian Peninsula, is that the people who would eventually start calling themselves the Spanish and the Portuguese, well, that took a long time, began pushing back the Islamic Empire and sort of establishing their rule over this territory here. And this is a map of the Iberian Peninsula in 1491. And oftentimes in intro class, I look out over the class and I say, now if you lived in this Iberian Peninsula in 1491, what would be the most important event in the next year, in 1492? They look at me and they say, eventually, somebody says, Columbus. And I say, and then I get cruel and I say, no, Columbus, that was October of 1492. Columbus would have been way off, many, many miles away. couldn't get word back because he didn't know communications like that. There were two huge events in 1492, though, especially if you lived in this peninsula. The first was the fall of the Kingdom of Granada, which was the last remaining Muslim caliphate in this territory, and was called Castile. We now kind of know of more as Spain. So in 1492, that was the sort of culmination of what was later called we hear about the conquest of the Americas. This was later called the Reconquest. And so, the Christians were already in a sort of conquering mood by the time Columbus set sail, because they had just expelled the last Muslim caliphate from the territory here in the Kingdom of Granada. In the same year was the expulsion, well, it was the edict which said that the Jews who lived in Castile, the Jews and the Muslims would either have to convert to Christianity or leave or be expelled. So as part of the Spanish Inquisition, this was a very key year. And so what I'm trying to get at here is there had been a lot of dynamic trade all across and a lot of sort of what we might call, in a weird way, multiculturalism. I mean, this was a very multicultural area at the time. But in this time, it's sort of a declaration of itself as a Christian place. And sort of the deliberate effort to say, well, if you're not Christian, if you're a Jew or a Muslim, you have to either convert or you have to leave. You have to be expelled. And that led to all sorts of other interesting consequences as well. But like I said, it took a while for the Columbus thing to get geared up. That was a sort of hugely important thing in 1492. So while that was happening, of course, Columbus is stumbling around and landing somewhere in the Caribbean. He's confused as to where he is, and so he calls it the Indies. He thinks he's off the coast of India or something. And so, for those of you who might wonder, still to this day, we consider this area, we call it the West Indies, which is kind of a strange thing. And that, of course, is how we get the name Indians, although, it's just a complete misnomer by Columbus, who was rather confused about where he was. He never completely figured that out. But on his second voyage, he did bring a lot of he brought enslaved Africans. He brought a lot of stuff to sort of colonize the places that he was laying claim to. A couple of historical facts about Columbus. We've just had Columbus Day, and we talked about the importance of Columbus for the Irish and Italian populations in the United States. But a couple little interesting things. First, it's interesting that Columbus actually sailed with the Spaniards and sailed under the Spanish flag. He spent most of his life trying to get money from the Portuguese, because the Portuguese were really the ones who knew what was going on, and but eventually they turned him down because not because they knew that the world was round, but they had correctly calculated that the world was larger than what Columbus said it was. And so they didn't want him going off because, they were more interested in sailing south, because they knew that this was that he had miscalculated the circumference of the world. And the other thing about Columbus, like I said, he was forgotten for many years, because many historians believe that if it hadn't been for Columbus, that another Portuguese sailor would have found, or Portuguese or Spanish sailor would have sort of found the Americas within 10 to 15 years, because the Portuguese were very interested in establishing this trade route into Asia. And so this is, again, one of those things that we have this tiny little place on the edge of Europe, Portugal, if you think about it, it's this little tiny place that establishes a transoceanic empire. And, I mean, it's something that sort of boggles the mind. They capture Ceuta, which is a city right in this little part of the Mediterranean in 1415, and they're sailing down the African coast. And of course, would later, settle or, colonize much of what is now Brazil, parts of Africa, had established trading posts in parts of India. And, and it's kind of amazing to think that, it lasted until 1999 when they handed Portuguese Macau to China. And so that, this is sort of something that we don't think about much, is how much the Portuguese, and they were all up in the northwest as well. I mean, they didn't have much interest in occupying land, but they were extremely good at sort of controlling trade routes and establishing these transoceanic routes, which for the first time, then these became hugely important in terms of world trade and establishing different kinds of trade routes across these various places. I say this too because, I mean, for those of you who are up on your politics and you think about, what's happening in the Brazilian rainforest and how you have this, there was an election in Brazil. They elected Bolsonaro, who's sometimes called the Trump of the tropics. And some of the things Bolsonaro says it seem completely confusing, but they make more sense if you put them in the context of sort of this, this European empire building and a kind of, this idea of, ruling the natives and economic exploitation. It sort of is part of what the Portuguese were up to at the time. Of course, the people who were more interested in sort of territorial control, interested in sort of exploiting the wealth and labor and sort of getting stuff from people, ended up being the Spanish colonizers who were originally mostly after gold. They did a lot of crazy things to try and get gold, but eventually what would pay off the most, they did extract a decent amount of gold from people in the Americas, but what would most be profitable for them was silver, both in what is now Mexico, but probably the most in what is now, well, the city of Potosi, in what is now Bolivia. And I sometimes ask students, if anybody's even ever heard of Potosi, if anybody even knows where it is. It's very rare to know where Potosi is, but this is, as this book that recently came out, The Silver City That Changed the World, Chris Lane says, I mean, this one place provided half of the world's silver. And the silver was hugely important. It went into Europe, but it also was used to sort of get a foothold into the trade routes to Asia and all, so it amplified the currency circulation in Europe, but also a lot of silver went from Europe into Asia as well. And so this is a hugely important city for hundreds of years. This is a painting of Potosi in 1758. You can already see sort of the urban street designs. Some people have called this the first city of capitalism. There were people here from all over the world, lots of different parts of Spain. If you go to Potosi today, you can see not just that people were there from Spain, but from the different places, the different parts of Spain. They had their little neighborhoods. There were, traders from all over the place who had come to this city, of course, to get a hold of the silver trade. And this city was actually, at its time, it was larger than London, it was larger than Paris. You would have definitely heard about it, or you would know of it. It was a pretty big deal. Right now, it's in Bolivia. Once we went there for a J term once, and it's really high and it's really cold, and there's some beautiful parts of it, but also pretty depressing. So they extracted a ton of silver from this mountain here, and you know, and also many lives, indigenous people's lives, were lost extracting the silver and processing it. This is if you go to the Potosi Museum, there's, you know, this is like, you know, putting the Virgin Mary in this hill of, you know, the hill of silver, which gives them dominance over the East and West. And this was a hugely important thing. And, you know, another strange little fact about this, a lot of people, it's hard to say, there's some debate about where did we get the dollar sign from? Where did that come from? But the most, I think the best theory on this is that the dollar sign was a result of the Potosi Mint. And so this was the mint symbol, and it eventually got condensed down to be the dollar sign, because this was sort of equivalent to money. And when the United States issued some of its first currency, its first paper currency, nobody wanted it because they were afraid that the US would default on its debts. And so they said, well, this, you know, the dollar would be worth, you know, what they called one Spanish peso. And so you could get a Spanish peso for your dollar. And so this was the kind of exchange that would allow it to have currency. And another funny thing, I don't know, I don't think I've ever had a student who remembers this, but for old people, and even for me growing up, we had this cheer that we had, which was 2 bits, 4 bits, 6 bits a dollar, all for, well, my hometown was Knoxon, all for Knoxon stand up and holler. So sometimes old people will talk about, you have to be pretty old, that 2 bits is the same as 25 cents. So 2 bits is 25 cents, 4 bits, 50 cents, 6 bits, a dollar. And you're like, what 2 bits? What are these people talking about? And what it was actually the Spanish peso had 8 sides. And people used to cut it up into 4 different parts. And so the parts were called bits. They would actually cut it up into 8 parts. And so the bits were each equal to an eighth. And so 2 bits is the same as a quarter. So, you know, it's a strange sort of holdover into our language. Like I said, I don't think I haven't heard of people recognizing it recently. But it's a strange holdover that reveals how much the peso, which is incredible, the peso was actually at the basis of our own monetary system. After that, we come into perhaps what is some more familiar territory to us. Like I said, we probably learn a little bit more about this in school than we learn about Potosi, which is that some of the Northern European powers, so the Dutch, the French, and the English, began to sort of peel off little bits of the Spanish Empire, especially in the Caribbean and in the northern, well, I would say the circum-Caribbean, so this area in here. So that's when various islands fall to Northern European powers. That's why in Jamaica they speak English, and in what is now Haiti, or what was Saint-Domingue, they spoke French and Haitian Creole. Because some of the Northern European powers began to consolidate some of these areas and to bring in enslaved Africans, mostly for sugar. And what I like about this map, I know Guest discusses the triangle trade. We all learn about the triangle trade. I'm not sure, I think that the problem with the triangle trade is we usually think about it as something that happens with the United States, and there's this route over here. I would say for the most part, the United States was really a very small player in some of these trades. So most of the enslaved Africans, almost half of them went into Brazil, what is now Brazil, mostly to grow sugar. And another almost half went into the Caribbean. And so there are various small Caribbean islands, that got as many or more enslaved Africans as the entire United States. So we often get this weird idea that, when we think about plantations and slavery and we have these cotton, and yes, cotton is very important. And it's not that slavery was unimportant in the United States. It's just that the main reason for doing this was to grow sugar, and it was a cruel way to go things. This is the sort of numeric breakdown of this. Brazil gets 4 million, or 35% of the slaves, the Spanish Empire and the British West Indies. Remember, that's the Caribbean, gets another 4.5 million. The French West Indies, again, Saint-Domingue gets over 1 million. And then when you get to British North America, 500,000, or not even 5% of the total enslaved Africans at the time. So we get kind of, like I said, we get a funny picture. We get a distorted picture of the slave trade sometimes in our US-centric account of it. This is a postcard of what was Saint-Domingue, the western side of Saint-Domingue, which became Haiti in the 18th century, before the Haitian Revolution. And this was an extremely wealthy colony for the French. It was sort of the jewel in the crown of the French Empire at the time. And one of the other things I'd like to point out about this postcard is how the plantation itself was very systematically organized, and you had to run something that was very close to a factory-like system in order to get this sugar processed, and in order to make it shippable, basically, back into the European places. And so what anthropologist Sidney Mintz has argued is that, not only were these plantations important for their raw materials and for their actual sugar that they produced, but they also provided a kind of template for factory production, which people then used later in the European Industrial Revolution. Guest discusses briefly in a sort of follow-up passage about what he calls anti-colonial struggles, the Haitian Revolution. I guess I would say it's a little bit, I wouldn't necessarily lump it together with anti-colonial struggles, because it came so early on. There was a long period of revolution. So for one thing, Saint-Domingue was connected to the French holdings. Of course, if you go down to Mardi Gras in New Orleans, that's where we find out that there's, kind of some French stuff going on in the United States. And this was an important sort of interchange, especially for the French Empire. And the Haitian Revolution is enormously important because it is the first and only time that Black enslaved Africans rose up and basically and were able to establish their own independent nation, and culminating in 1804, although it was sort of well underway by then. Napoleon tried to sort of re-enslave the Haitian revolt, but failed. And after that failure of putting down the Haitian Revolution, that's when Napoleon decided to sell out the Louisiana Purchase to Jefferson at very cheap prices. And so, it could be that the Louisiana Purchase would have happened anyway without the Haitian Revolution, but the Haitian Revolution was hugely important in United States history, because without Haiti, Napoleon didn't think it was useful to hang on to the rest of this area that the French had claimed in North America. And so, you know, I mean, it's one of those things, again, we don't learn about this in school at all, but if it wouldn't have been for the Haitian Revolution, it would have probably been much more difficult to make this purchase possible. The other thing that happened is that you had slaveholders in, you know, obviously in this part of the United States who were watching things going on in Haiti and were extremely concerned about, you know, hey, I mean, it was unthinkable at the time that, you know, that Black people, people of color, people, enslaved people could rebel to this extent and be able to set up their own government. It was completely unthinkable, and they did a lot to try to prevent that. So the Haitian Revolution is hugely important in US history, but oddly missing from most of our textbooks. So to summarize, by the year 1800, we had already seen a world that had been reshaped by the Portuguese Empire and by the Spanish Empire, and especially with the silver from Potosi and other places and gold, revitalizing the world trade routes which had existed previously, which people had been interconnected, but were really given a strong boost by these new resources from the Americas. After that, one of the main stories shifts to the sugar plantations in the Caribbean and in Brazil that took this exotic good. Açúcar was seen for many years as kind of something you might have occasionally. It was a luxury good, and it became something that was eaten, drunk every day by most people. And so, especially when it was combined with other colonial crops, coffee and tea, it became a huge change in diet, that you were able to get so many calories from sugar that you were able to sort of fuel, quite literally fuel your work and change your dietary and work habits. And so it's, you know, I mean, a lot of people, we learn about the Industrial Revolution, but it's hard to imagine how the European Industrial Revolution would have ever happened were it not for this, you know, these kinds of labor and resources coming in from the colonies. And as I talked about, and as the anthropologist Sid Mintz has talked about, even the sort of work discipline and how you could produce different commodities was probably based on or in interaction with the kind of disciplinary systems that were enacted in the plantations in the Americas. Big, however, though, is that once industrialization gets rolling and some of the cities in Europe and America get going, a lot of these things were forgotten about. So that Potosi was once one of the biggest cities in the world, totally forgotten. That, you know, I mean, that Haiti was a extremely prosperous place where so much wealth was created. If you say Haiti today, people think earthquake, poverty. And so a lot of the places that were extremely important, the places and people that were extremely important in the creation of the Industrial Revolution get marginalized, pushed out, forgotten, left as basically, basically I would say environmental disasters. If you go to Potosi today and the mines are just, you know, I mean, they're like polluting the water, you know, like many mineral extraction efforts around the world. And so by 1800, the world had already was arranged in a new kind of hierarchy in which the Northern Europeans were sort of established at the top of the hierarchy in a way that would have been crazy 700, 800, 1,000 years ago, but the world had been rearranged. And for the Northern Europeans, they then began to come up with these ideas about, well, why are people different from each other? And their main explanations became, well, ideas about race, which had been, as we talked about in our class on race, formed under the colonial system, or ideas about the environment. And, so the idea of why the world was the way it was then ascribed to people's biology or the place where they lived. And this became a way of either maintaining or justifying the inequalities of the world system as it was. And so, again, you'll notice that this is already true, a couple hundred years ago, that people had already sort of mapped out this space for others, which completely ignored their contributions, their political systems, their ideas, and set up a very different structure of the world that would not have been recognizable to someone living, say, in probably even at the time of Columbus in the year 1500. And so, taking a quote from an English traveler, the book that his journals that he recorded, he went all the way around the world, and this was, in the 1830s, he was observing some native peoples in the Tierra del Fuego, which is way down in southern, what is now southern Argentina, very close to the Antarctic. This is what he said about the people that he was observing. He said, hey, according to our notions, according to English notions, these people aren't even speaking articulate language. We don't have any reason to believe that they have religion. They don't have a political system. They don't have a government. They don't even know what it's like to have a home or feel domestic affection. And then this last part, which is important for our unit on economy, their skill in some respects may be compared to the instinct of animals, for it is not improved by experience. So, you have to remember this is, the whole idea of, what we now call more politely hunters and gatherers, at the time in the 1830s was said to be, well, they're just living like animals. They're wild man chasing wild animals. And they're not, they don't have any culture. They don't have any language. They don't have any of this stuff. Again, this would have been, I think, even for people who were, when the Europeans were first landing in the Americas, they were very interested in sort of subjugating them, but they were also often in awe of a lot of their accomplishments. The floating gardens of Mexico City, the enormous the road system of the Inca. So this idea that what this person was observing was really people who were had been completely marginalized and subdued at this time, and for him, these people were sort of a kind of you might consider them biologically human, but they weren't they weren't even worthy of thinking about. So I have to ask, who was this guy? That was our buddy Charles Darwin doing his voyage of the Beagle. He went around, and then after this he sailed up to the Galapagos Islands and did the finches and all this stuff. So it isn't, I'm not trying to say that Charles Darwin was uniquely bad. This was pretty much a common idea at the time about what people thought. So, like I said, it's hugely important for anthropology, but it's also hugely important for all of us to understand, where do we get these stereotypes about sort of these people living in a state of nature, or how, how people don't have a language or things. And so if we compare that to what we learn from anthropology, right? We had that whole chapter on language about, hey, people have language. Come on, Darwin. They have language. They have interesting languages, and we can watch that video with Lera Boroditsky talking about the directional languages and how cool they are and all those things. And then religion, we'll talk about that in a couple classes. We talk about religious beliefs, but I mean, certainly one of the huge contributions of anthropology is to say, hey, the people do have religious beliefs. They may not have a formal, churches and all the things that we have, but they certainly have religious beliefs. We've read about kinship. Oh, wait. No, we'll be reading about politics too. So eventually we'll talk about, different political organizations and different ways in which people govern themselves. And that's one of the things that we say as anthropologists. We've talked about kinship and kinship complexities and cross cousins and matrilineal, matrilateral ideas. So, different kinds of kinship systems and how much people are different, or are sophisticated in terms of their kinship reckonings and ideas about family. And then I'd like to concentrate on this last part, because this is sort of where Guest begins the chapter, which is, do other people have an economic system worthy of study or worthy of being respected? And we have to remember that one of the reasons people justified the removal of other people from their land was because they said, well, they're not doing anything efficient here. They're just, they're not producing anything. They're being all hunter and gatherer stuff, and that's just wild man stuff. And so this is where, the anthropological definition of economy, a cultural adaptation to the environment that enables a group of humans to use the available land, resources, and labor to satisfy their needs and to thrive, comes in. So we come back to the beginning of the chapter, but I guess I think it's hugely important that this definition of an economy really doesn't make a whole lot of sense unless you compare it to the stereotypes and the ideas that other people were cultureless, that they didn't know how to use land, that they couldn't use resources, that they couldn't thrive, and that therefore we had to do other things with their land and their resources and tell them how to use their labor. So, Guest in this chapter begins from this point, and he begins by talking about, the sophisticated and ultimately one of the most sustainable systems that has ever existed, which is the hunting and gathering system. But like I said, I don't think it entirely makes sense unless we think about the way in which the world became organized so that people were deprived of these very notions and ideas. So that's my lesson. That's my history lesson for today. Questions?